the screen. Last week we began with the laws of blood. So in summary, where are we? In summary, we spoke about eggs and blood and how eggs should be checked. We spoke about fish blood, which is kosher provided you leave it together with the scales. We spoke about if a person is bleeding in one's mouth, that as long as the bloods have not left his mouth, that's fine. But once they leave, like if I put into an apple and the gums are inflamed, then they would have to remove the blood from the apple before putting it back into one's mouth, because that wouldn't be kosher. And we mentioned how there can be complications with if one finds blood in milk, although that's pretty unlikely in today's 21st century with everything industrialized. Now let's talk about milk and meat. A lot to be said, a lot to be learned. So a mixture of meat and milk is forbidden to be eaten or to be cooked. So the Torah actually has 3 prohibitions in connection with milk and meat. 3 times in the Torah it says you shouldn't cook a you shouldn't cook a goat or a lamb in his mother's milk, which the rabbis learn is not just his mother, but any milk, and not just the lamb, but any meat. But it says it 3 times. 1 time teaches us that we cannot eat milk and meat together. The 2nd time teaches us that we cannot cook milk and meat together. And the 3rd time teaches us that if milk and meat were cooked together, then one isn't even allowed to derive any form of benefit from that combination. I'll speak about different scenarios of that in a few moments. So if something becomes forbidden due to a mixture of meat and milk, a rabbinic authority must be consulted about what should be done with the mixture, for sometimes it is forbidden even to derive benefit from it. Sometimes deriving benefit is not forbidden. So that would pretty much depend on primarily whether the milk and meat was cooked together or if it was just placed together. So if milk and meat were only mixed together but they weren't cooked together, then you wouldn't be allowed to derive benefit by selling them. But if they were actually cooked together, then you would not be allowed to derive benefit. So I remember getting a friend of mine's father received a question from somebody that was in prison on not good basis, meaning it wasn't very fair. And this person had a question where from time to time they would give out cheeseburgers. And that became there's like kind of like an undercurrent trade in jails where people kind of, whatever they get as far as food, they're able to trade it for other benefits. So this particular Jew had asked my friend's father, Rabbi, is he allowed to give the cheeseburger to the other inmates? And then that would be a brownie point at his part. Then he would be to his benefit. And if it boiled down to how the cheeseburger was being prepared, if the cheese and the meat are actually cooked or fried together, which is often the way it is done, then not only can't he eat it, but he would actually have to dispose of it, which you could imagine would end up leaving him with a grumpy lot of guys. You know, one thing that you don't want to eat it, another thing that you won't give it to us. But the Torah forbids not only eating it, but even deriving benefit from it. But also part of the equation would be what type of meat was it? Does the prohibition of milk and meat apply to non-kosher meat? I don't remember offhand. I think it does. So anyhow, if a person did have milk and meat that came combined, then and there was a big they wanted to sell it or give it away, then one should consult a rabbi who would get into the details. Okay, so that's as far as avoiding them getting mixed together, the actual milk and the actual meat. If you have 2 Jews who know each other, even if they're critical of each other, so they're not the best of friends, they're not allowed to eat at the same table, one person meat and one person milk. So if you're sitting down for supper and you want to have pizza and your wife wants to have schnitzel, then you wouldn't be allowed to sit at the same table unless you make a hecker, unless you make a distinction, a reminder, so that you won't come to eat from each other's food. So what would that be? If you've got 2 different mini tablecloths, that would work. Or if one person is using a placemat and the other person isn't, or if there's something on the table, maybe if you just put some kind of little something that's somewhat lifted from the table, maybe a phone would suffice. I'm not sure. If it's always there, then it won't work. But if it's not usually there, maybe it would work. But something to remind you that you don't want to share from each other's plates because you don't want to come to mixed milk and meat. So that's actually a halachic requirement that if two people are eating together one milk and meat, then there needs to be some kind of either tablecloth, a placemat, or some object between them to remind them not to partake from each other's plates. The same would go as far as even if it's a cup of water, which is part of, but you wouldn't want to share the same cup because when one person drinks from the cup, if they've just had some schnitzel, some schnitzel crumbs may, or meatball, whatever it is, may get onto the sides of the cup. And then when the other person who's busy eating his pizza drinks from the same cup, so there's going to be transfer over here. So I guess this also ties back into, I guess, the more recent awareness of trying to avoid spreading from one person to another. So in a religious context, not only shouldn't a person eat milk and meat together, but if two people are eating one milk and one meat, then they shouldn't share the same cup because that would also cause the milk and meat to be transferred from one to another. Similarly, with regards to bread, if bread was served on a table with meat, and there may be, the meat may have gotten a little bit meaty in the process, or would have gotten a little cheesy in the process, then you should make sure not to go ahead and use that bread for the reverse. So practically speaking, for example, if by your Shabbos meal you've cut up some challah and you've put it around the table and then you serve some shallot, so that challah that was used by your Shabbos table should not then be used together with some cheese on Sunday afternoon because it may have some vestige of meat on it. However, if you have a special challah dish or a challah tray and anything that goes out doesn't come back in, then there wouldn't be a problem because you're just cutting up the challah and you're putting it straight into that dish, and the challah hopefully is not making its way into the challah dish. It's just maybe out around the table. So yeah, that's the idea. Bread that's been out on a table where it may have come in contact with other foods, milk or meat, shouldn't be just served on the table of the opposite foods. But if it was in its own designated bowl, it wouldn't be an issue. Similarly, salt. So nowadays, usually we have salt dispensers, but if you have a salt dish, again, you wouldn't want to use that same bowl that has salt in it for a milk and meat meal because some drops of meat or milk might fall into that dish, and then you'd have a mixture of milk and meat. So as far as salt shakers, as long as you're pouring the salt onto cold food, then there's no issue. But the truth is that for cooking, if you're adding salt to your either something dairy that you're cooking up, or let's say, I don't know, cheese lasagna, and then you want to add some salt later to your chicken soup. So it would be better not to pour from the dispenser directly onto those different parts because the steam, which is thick, can take the taste of the meat or milk back into the salt shaker. And besides for the fact that it might clog up the holes once it becomes full of moisture, you might actually have it's better to have, if you're pouring straight into a pot, which is commonly done, it is actually good to have two salt dispensers, one for milk and one for meat. So you could maybe get two different colors, blue or red, or any two colors, or way that you could remember to keep them separate. So that's as far as food not swapping over from one to the other. Same would go for knives. It is customary to mark knives that are used for dairy foods as well as other dairy dishes so they're not interchanged. He mentioned knives because that's spoken about in the Shulchan Aruch, but this is where the concept comes of having two sets of dishes, one set of dishes for your dairy meals and one set of dishes for your meat meals. I'm reminded there was a Professor Baranova. He was I have his book, fascinating story. He lived in communist Russia and came to discover God and religion under strict communist rule. And I remember hearing how he had two sets of dishes for milk and meat although usually one would be obligated for them to be different, if he had had separate dishes, then he would have been caught by the communists, because back in the day, who were the secret police of the communists? There was your local Jew, Yankel. You had no idea, Yankel or Moshele, if he was a communist and working for the secret police, or he was trying hard to keep his Yiddishkeit alive. There wouldn't be much way of knowing one from the other, as they both grew up with you in school. Just one person became a communist and one didn't. So he actually, I remember hearing that he had two sets of dishes that were identical. And he had to keep track which ones were milk and which ones were meat. That way, when people came around to check in on him, they wouldn't see that he was keeping kosher, but he was. But under regular circumstances, certainly the dishes should be two different sets. So that's as far as preventing food from transferring from one to the other. So this last point of a knife could be, if the knife was dirty, it would be an issue. But even if it was clean, if it was used for hot or sharp foods, then it would have the ability to extract taste from milk and then inject that milky taste into meat, or vice versa. So that's why we have separate dishes, because if there's heat or sharpness involved, then the taste can be transferred, and that could be a problem. Now, a person that has eaten meat, or even a dish that was prepared with meat, is not allowed to eat dairy for 6 hours. Now, I know that there are some communities in South Africa where they have a tradition to wait 3 hours. I don't know what the source of that is. I do know that in the Shulchan Aruch, in the original Code of Jewish Law, it speaks about waiting 6 hours. It gives two different opinions why one would wait 6 hours. We'll see that a moment in the Shulchan Aruch. And then it mentions that some are lenient and only wait an hour, but one should be stringent. So there are communities that only waited an hour after having meat to having milk. So I don't know if it was in a similar vein that the jihadists in South Africa, there are communities that wait 3 hours. So if you have such a custom that's been passed down, then you could hold on to that custom. But if you're starting to keep kosher and looking for guidance, then the standard practice is to wait a full 6 hours from meat to milk. Now, what's the source of this? So the Gemara says that, I actually didn't look up the Gemara before the class, but the Gemara speaks about how a person should have them go from one meal to the next. And meals would usually be about 6 hours apart. So it would be in general in Torah sources, it speaks about people eating twice a day, in the morning and in the evening. It seems like lunch didn't happen much. And the way the Gemara describes it, that gap from one meal to the next implies 6 hours. But it's not just vague, it's pretty clear. It's just vague to me because I didn't get a chance to look it up before I gave the class. Now, the reason for waiting 6 hours, there are two different opinions amongst the commentaries in the Talmud. I think Rashi and Rambam, the Maimonides. One reason is because it takes time to get the pieces of food out from between your teeth. So by 6 hours, it should be out. And if there's anything that's still there, you could just take it out and it's gone. But less than 6 hours, there could still be little bits and pieces of food in your mouth. That's one reason that's brought, I think, by the Rambam. But then the other opinion, which I think is Rashi, says that the taste kind of still sticks around in your throat. And that's the reason to wait 6 hours. Interestingly, as we'll see soon, hard Swiss cheese that's made through an aging process, actually has the halachic status of meat. And so after eating such cheese, you would actually need to wait 6 hours before having meat. Let's see that inside in a few moments. So that's pretty much a rundown. Now, there's people, I've often heard it being said that you wait a couple of hours so they're not in your system together. That is not true. Certainly, it's possible where a person can have them in his system at the same time. Not necessarily is he removing from his body whatever he's eaten within the last 6 hours. But the idea is specifically while it's in your mouth. So in your mouth, not just when you actually feel it, but for the next 6 hours, it gets stuck between your teeth, or you feel it in your throat. The taste kind of comes back to you a little bit in your throat. So we wait 6 hours. Okay. Now, yeah, that is from meat to milk. If after 6 hours you still found a piece of biltong between your teeth, he says you could just remove it and you could just wash your mouth out. You wouldn't need to wait another 6 hours, or maybe eat something. So you're using both liquids and solids to clear your mouth of that piece of biltong that you just found between your teeth, or whatever it may be. If the food you ate did not contain meat, nor the fat of meat, but it was simply cooked in a pot used for cooking meat, meaning a fleischer pot in a meat pot, so then you would be allowed to eat dairy products immediately afterwards, provided that you washed your mouth out. As I just discussed, after eating cheese, you're allowed to eat meat immediately, as long as it's not in the same meal. So if you had bread, you would have to conclude the meal that you had on cheese and then move on to the meal of meat. This is something that is done on Shavuos. On Shavuos, it's a Yom Tov, so a person should have meat, but there's also a custom to have dairy. So you wouldn't be allowed to serve for the first course cheesecake and for the second course beef, because it's in the same meal. You would actually have to end the meal, get up, bench, and get up, and then start the second meal a little bit later. So milk and meat cannot be eaten in the same meal, but once they're in a separate meal, halachically, you are allowed to eat meat immediately after eating milk, provided that you've washed your hands out and you've washed your mouth with a liquid and a solid. So if it was hard cheese, as I mentioned, that has the status of meat. It's like Swiss cheese, and then you would actually need to wait 6 hours after having your Swiss cheese before eating any dairy products. Okay. We'll stop over here. And please God, we'll continue with the next halachas to learn more about milk and meat and other kashrus issues that come up. We'll learn about wine and things relating to that. We'll learn about if you received food without a seal. Just today, somebody asked the question, they received a package of meat and it didn't have a based in stamp on it. They knew it was from a kosher outlet, but they were wondering, is it still kosher to eat if it isn't sealed with a based in seal? So these are all interesting discussions, please God, that we could continue next week. Wishing you a wonderful Shabbos.